Hi, guys. The three countries that I had to compare were obviously the USA, Singapore, and Zimbabwe. I started by comparing the GDP numbers. First, the PPP number. For USA, that was 16.72 trillion. Singapore was second with 339 billion, and Zimbabwe was the lowest with 7.5 billion. The GDP official exchange rate for USA, they also had the highest with 16.72 trillion. Singapore followed with 296 billion, and Zimbabwe was the lowest with again a low number of 10.5 billion. The GDP per capita, the USA, Singapore, and Zimbabwe all had positive numbers. The USA, of course, had 52,800. Singapore was higher with 62,400 and Zimbabwe with $600. As far as unemployment rate went, Zimbabwe had the highest number with 95%. That would definitely be a problem for their economy. The USA followed with 7.3, and Singapore was actually 1.9. Inflation rates, the USA was 1.5, this Singapore was 2.4, and Zimbabwe was 8.5. Um, Export numbers, the USA had 1.575 trillion. Singapore followed with 410.3 billion, and Zimbabwe with 3.144 billion. You would definitely want this number to be higher than your imports, and this was not the case for the US. Their imports were 2.273 trillion, which again was higher than their export number. Singapore was 373 billion, and Zimbabwe was also higher with 4.571 billion. This made their balance of trade. The U.S. had a negative number of negative 698 billion. Zimbabwe also had a negative number, but not as large, negative 1.427 billion. Of course, they also have lower GDP numbers and a much higher unemployment rate. And Singapore actually had 37.3 billion, which was a positive number for them. As far as the foreign exchange rate went, Singapore was their dollar or currency was closer to the US dollar with 1.25 per US dollar. Zimbabwe's was 234.25 per US dollar. And as far as what seemed to be important when comparing the countries, I would have to say all the numbers. If your imports are too high compared to your exports, you find yourself in a deficit like the US. Singapore, however, was in a surplus with a greater number of exports than imports. GDP is definitely important when determining a country's economy size and worth. These numbers should be high to reflect economic health. Economic growth can also be shown through productivity. Therefore, you would want a low unemployment number. And in this case, Zimbabwe was in the worst position with a 95% unemployment rate. Overall, the US is most definitely the most powerful economy, which is no surprise to any of us. And Zimbabwe is in certainly, crisis economically, which may not be a surprise to some of you. Um, Singapore actually, seems to have a stable economy, although definitely not as large as the US. So I thank everyone for watching, and I hope you have a great weekend.